The boot came to Elias Dodd on a Tuesday in August 1864, and before he had turned it over twice in his hands, he knew three things. The man who wore it walked with his weight pressed hard onto the outside ball of his left foot. He had been doing it for at least 5 months, and he patrolled the northeastern fence line of Camp Sumpter, the 40-foot corridor between Deadline Post 12 and Watchtower 7, every morning between 4 a.m. and noon without deviation. Nobody told Elias any of this. No guard admitted a route. No officer shared a schedule. Elias simply pressed his right thumb along the inside lip of the cork heel, felt where the material had compressed into a crescent 3 millimeters deep on the outer edge and almost untouched on the inner, and understood. This man was never still, never straight, and never late. His name does not appear in any Union Army prisoner record, any Andersonville investigation transcript, or any document produced by the 1865 Congressional War Crimes hearings that sent Commandant Henry Wirz to the gallows. It appears once, in pencil, in the right margin of a camp shoemaker's material requisition list, in someone else's handwriting, next to the words, "Paid in full." Everything else that follows was assembled from the testimony of 23 men who walked out of Andersonville alive, and who, when asked separately and years apart how they had known when to move, said the same thing without coordinating their answers. The boots told us. He set the boot sole up on his knee and examined it for another 30 seconds without moving. The compound was already at 98 degrees by mid-morning. A white Georgia August, pressing down on 33,000 men, packed into 26 acres of open clay and rotting wood. Dysentery moved through the stockade like weather. The smell was permanent and total. Wood smoke over rot, over the sweetish copper smell of wounds that had stopped hurting, which was worse than wounds that still did. The creek bisecting the camp, Providence Creek, which had once run clear, was the color of rust and served simultaneously as drinking water, latrine, and kitchen runoff channel. Men died of thirst 6 feet from water they could not drink. Elias had been here 187 days. He had buried 11 men he knew by name. His shoemaking area was a square of dirt, 8 feet by 8 feet, in the northeastern quadrant of the prisoner compound, partially shaded by a lean-to. 3 men ahead of his arrival had built from fence rail scraps and a section of tent canvas. The Confederates permitted it. They permitted it because boots wore out on both sides of the fence, and Elias Dodd was the only man in Camp Sumpter who could rebuild a heel from raw leather scrap without a last form or a proper awl, using a sharpened iron tent stake and a piece of hooping wire he had requested as payment from his first Confederate customer in March. The awl made a specific sound when it drove through dried leather, a short, dense pop, like a knuckle cracking, followed by the soft resistance of the cork beneath. He heard it 300 to 400 times a day. 1 awl, 1 roll of wire, 47 square inches of salvaged leather. This was his entire inventory, and it was enough. He set the boot down. He picked up the awl. Elias Dodd was 31 years old, born in Galion, Ohio, in 1833, to a harness maker who had emigrated from Pennsylvania 10 years earlier and set up a small repair shop on the east side of Crawford County. He learned to work leather before he learned to read, which his mother later told people with some embarrassment, and which Elias considered a fair trade. By age 14, he was doing independent sole repairs. By 17, he was taking commissions for full boot construction. 34 separate cuts of leather, 160 to 200 hand stitches, depending on boot height, and a knowledge of the customer's gait that most cobblers developed over years of watching people walk toward them across a shop floor. Elias developed it faster than most. He had noticed something by age 12 that he'd never found a way to fully articulate. The way a man stressed his weight across the inside of a sole told you something true about him. Not just his posture. Something about how he moved through the world. A heavily worn inner heel on the right foot meant caution. A man who stopped and reoriented before committing to direction. A deep crease behind the second toe meant speed, aggression. Someone who launched forward before his heel had fully landed. He couldn't have explained the system as a system. He just knew boots. He enlisted in the 52nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry in May of 1862, age 29. Having waited longer than most men in Galion because his father died in December 1861, and there was a shop debt of $47 to resolve. He served through Kentucky and into Tennessee, repairing footwear for his company in the evenings, and quietly for 2 adjacent companies whose cobblers had been killed or mustered out, using salvaged materials, a private's pay of $13 a month, and a reputation that spread along supply lines faster than any commendation he received. "Dodd'll fix it" became a phrase in the 52nd that had nothing to do with shoemaking specifically. It meant, whatever is broken, take it to the quiet man from Ohio. He was captured at Chickamauga in September 1863, second day of fighting, when a Confederate flanking movement collapsed the Union right, and Elias's company, 78 men at morning muster, was surrounded in a cedar thicket and ordered to lay down arms. He spent 5 months in Confederate holding before arriving at Andersonville, transferred through 3 facilities in Georgia, each worse than the last. He entered Camp Sumpter on February 27, 1864, through the North Gate, among a column of 340 prisoners. He weighed 141 pounds. He had weighed 178 at Chickamauga. The camp had been open less than 3 weeks. The stockade walls, 15-foot pine logs set vertically into a trench 5 feet deep, were still raw wood, still wet-smelling. The interior had been a stand of longleaf pine 3 months earlier. The trees had been felled, stripped, and driven into the earth, and the interior left as churned clay. There was no shelter. There was no sanitation system. There was a shallow trench. At the southern end, the prisoners called the sink, serving as the communal latrine for what would soon become the largest prison in Confederate territory. By the time Elias arrived, 7,500 men were already inside. By June, it would be 26,000. By August, 33,000. Elias found his 8x8 feet on his 3rd day in the northeastern corner, on slightly higher elevation that improved drainage by approximately 4 inches, enough to keep his sleeping area dry in rain. He built the lean-to on his 4th day. He received his first Confederate boot repair request on his 7th day, from a sergeant who had watched him resole a fellow prisoner's shoe using leather cut from a rotted haversack. The sergeant set the boot in front of him without speaking. "Left heel," Elias said without looking up. "Outside edge, 6 weeks, maybe 8. The sergeant stared at him. How do you know which heel? The way you walked over here, Elias said. The sergeant left the boot. He came back 3 days later to collect it, and left also, without speaking, a 4-inch strip of vegetable-tanned sole leather. Elias estimated it had come from a broken harness. He did not thank him audibly. He set the leather on his knee and began to think. By July 1864, men were dying at Camp Sumpter at a rate of approximately 97 per day. The causes were dysentery, pneumonia, scurvy, gangrene from untreated wounds, and a general systemic collapse the camp surgeon cataloged as debility, the Confederacy's medical shorthand for starvation. The official daily ration was 1.25 pounds of cornmeal per man. The actual ration, once transport losses, spoilage, and guardside pilfering were accounted for, was closer to 9 ounces. The difference was 7 ounces of cornmeal per day, multiplied by 33,000 men, extracted daily by a supply chain in which the Confederate Army had chosen to take no particular interest. Escape was the only option. Escape required information. 3 tunneling attempts had been made in Elias's proximity before August. The first, begun in April by a group of 11 men working in 4-hour shifts, reached 22 feet before a Confederate guard noticed the subsidence depression on the outer stockade wall and collapsed it from above with a log ram. 2 men were inside. Both survived. Both were put in the stocks for 6 days. The second tunnel was betrayed, by whom nobody established with certainty, after 8 days of work. The third failed at 14 feet, when diggers hit a layer of saturated river clay that poured into the shaft, faster than they could remove it. The tunnels failed for the same reason every time. They were dug blind. To escape Camp Sumpter, a prisoner needed to know not where the fence was. Every man in the stockade knew where the fence was, but where the guards were. Not in general, in precise terms. Which tower held how many men on what schedule, looking in which direction, with what regularity between posts. The stockade perimeter was 1,620 feet of fence line. The watchtowers, 18 of them, spaced at irregular intervals Elias had estimated between 80 and 100 feet apart, were each staffed by 2 men during daylight and 3 after dark. At ground level between towers, pairs of guards walked patrol routes Elias had observed from his corner over 5 months. Routes that seemed standardized but had subtle variations he could not resolve from 200 feet away. Through the boundary the prisoners called the dead line, an inner rail set 19 feet from the stockade wall, beyond which any prisoner who stepped was shot on sight without warning. The dead line was a pine rail set 19 feet from the stockade wall, the most effective information barrier in the Confederacy, and it cost nothing to build and required no maintenance, because the fact of it was enough. No prisoner could approach the fence close enough to study a guard's route without crossing it. No prisoner could communicate detailed patrol information across 26 acres of open ground, past 33,000 men, to a tunnel team working in silence in the northeastern corner, without a Confederate informant intercepting the message somewhere in a chain that stretched across a stockade where men traded information for food and had been hungry for months. You can't carry a map through a camp where every man is searched at the gate, unless the map is already on his feet. But the insight came to Elias in July, not in a single moment but across approximately 11 days. Built observation by observation the way a soul is built stitch by stitch. Nothing wasted, nothing added that doesn't bear weight. Confederate guards had been bringing him boots since March. By June, he had repaired footwear for 23 individual guards. He hadn't kept the count deliberately. He kept it the way a cobbler keeps knowledge of customers, stored in the specific, located in the physical. Private Lassiter from Watchtower 4 had a 3-inch overlap scar on his right inner ankle that changed his push-off pattern and wore his outside toe box down to the welt within 6 weeks. Sergeant Kane, who commanded the North Gate detail, struck his heels so hard into the clay that he had compressed the cork of both heel cups into wooden hard planks within 60 days. A young guard whose name Elias never learned, 17 years old at most, thin-shouldered in a jacket, 2 sizes large, dragged his left toe on every single step, a chronic ground-scraping shuffle that told Elias his calves cramped constantly, which told Elias he was dehydrated, which told Elias he was taking water from the same contaminated creek as the prisoners. By July, the boots told him more than the men did. He started with a question he couldn't yet answer. If every guard walked the same stockade earth every day at the same pace on the same route for the same number of hours, why did their boots wear differently? The answer was not complicated. It was carpenter simple. A man walking a straight line on flat ground wears his sole evenly front to heel, slightly heavier on the dominant foot. A man who stops and turns at the same 2 points every day, at the same interval, develops an asymmetric wear crescent on the outer ball of his turning foot, the foot that anchors the pivot. The depth of the crescent told Elias how often the turn happened. The specific location of the crescent, forward of center or rearward of center, told him whether the guard was turning to face inward, toward the prisoners, or outward, toward the forest. He took a straight pine splinter from the lean-to frame. He began pressing it into the worn areas of each next guard boot that came to him, measuring depth differentials in fractions of splinter width, precise to approximately 1.5 millimeters, which was precise enough. He did this to every boot over 11 consecutive days. He made no written notes. He had no paper. He held the information the way he had always held it, physically, spatially, in the specific arrangement of pressure and absence that his hands understood before his mind did. By July 22nd, he knew the morning patrol routes of 7 guards in the northeastern and northern fence sectors to within an accuracy of approximately 12 feet. He knew where they turned. He knew how long they stood before moving. He knew which watchtower pair swept east to west versus west to east during the 6 a.m. shift change, based on asymmetric toe box wear patterns of men rotating their bodies outside their natural stance to cover their assigned sight line. He knew where the gap was. A 22-second window every morning between 5:47 and 5:49. The northeastern fence line between Watchtower 7 and Deadline Post 12 had no direct eye-line coverage. Watchtower 7's pair was completing their north sweep. The ground patrol between posts 11 and 13 was at its farthest turning point, 68 feet distant. The eastern tower's sight line was blocked by the angle of the rising sun. 22 seconds, 11 feet of fence, a space the Confederacy had accidentally built into its own rotation schedule and had no idea existed. Elias Dodd sat with this for 3 days. He told no one. The problem was delivery. He tried twice before it worked. The first attempt was verbal. A description passed through 4 men in a carefully routed chain from Elias's corner to the tunnel team 190 feet away. He described the 22-second window in directional terms. Northeastern quadrant between the posts, 5:47 start. The message arrived corrupted. The 4th man in the chain, a fevered corporal from New Hampshire who had not eaten a full ration in 11 days, transposed the coordinates and told the tunnel crew it was the northwestern fence line. They adjusted their exit by 15 degrees. The tunnel would have emerged directly beneath Watchtower 3. The second attempt was a scratched diagram drawn with a tent stake into a piece of bark. A Confederate corporal intercepted it at the daily prisoner count during a random material search. The scratches looked like random gouges, nothing legible, but the bark was confiscated, and Elias understood that material transmission was finished. He went back to the boots. What he built next was not a code, not a cipher, not a system requiring interpretation. It was physical information embedded in sole material that anyone searching the boot would read as wear patterns, because they were wear patterns. Elias chose specifically where he placed new cork and leather when rebuilding a sole. A crescent stitched into the left inner ball, mimicking an inward turn wear pattern, indicated a direction. Positioned toward the toe, it meant the gap was in the forward fence sector. Positioned toward the heel, the rearward sector. The depth of the replacement material, flush, or 1.5 millimeters recessed, indicated timing. Morning or afternoon window. He demonstrated the system once, silently, to a single man, a corporal from Indiana named Marsh, who repaired the tunnel's support bracing and who had, in civilian life, worked as a furniture maker, and who understood without words what a specific compression in a specific material meant. He handed Marsh his own boot. Marsh turned it over, pressed his thumb where Elias indicated, looked up. "Northeast," Marsh said. "Morning." Elias held up 5 fingers, closed his hand. Then 2 more. 5:47, Marsh said. Elias took the boot back. He nodded once. He did not speak. 4 days later, on the morning of August 4th, 1864, while the Confederate guards at Watchtower 7 were completing their north sweep and the ground patrol stood at its farthest turning point, 3 men exited the tunnel at the northeastern fence line at 5:47 a.m. and cleared the abattis, the sharpened outer stake barrier, by 5:49. The sun was in the eastern tower's sight line. The ground was quiet. 2 of the 3 men reached Union lines. The Confederate Camp Command investigated for 9 days after the August 4th escape. Standard Andersonville procedure. Search prisoner quarters. Confiscate tunneling materials. Increase the frequency of boot and clothing searches at the daily head count. Commandant Henry Wirtz, a Swiss-born officer who managed Camp Sumpter with a combination of administrative efficiency and what surviving prisoners described unanimously as deliberate indifference to their physical condition, posted a notice on the camp gate offering a 3-day ration supplement to any prisoner who provided information on the tunnel's construction. Nobody came forward. The Confederates found the tunnel on the 6th day. It ran 39 feet, shored with fence rail sections, and covered with a sliding clay panel on the interior end. They found nothing to indicate how the escapees had timed their exit. They expanded the search to prisoner craftsmen. the small number of men permitted to do repair work serving both sides of the fence. Elias was among them. A sergeant whose boots Elias had repaired 3 weeks earlier came to the lean-to on August 13th with 2 other men and a list of questions written on requisition paper. Had Elias communicated with the escapees? Had he received material compensation beyond approved payment? Had he seen the tunnel? Elias answered each question in the same tone he used when working. Quiet, specific, unhurried. No, no, no. The sergeant searched his 8x8 area, turned over the leather scraps, examined the wire, pressed his hands into the ground at the lean-to's edge. The sergeant picked up the one boot Elias was mid-repair, a Confederate private's left boot, heel rebuilt, waiting for final sole stitching. He turned it over, pressed his thumb into the cork. He held it for 7 seconds. "What's this pattern here?" the sergeant said. It was not entirely a question. Elias looked at the boot without taking it. "Heel counter was collapsed," he said. "New cork beds different than old. Settles in 3-4 days." The sergeant turned the boot once more. Set it down. He left. Elias picked up his awl. His hand was steady. His pulse was not. He knew the sergeant had not understood what he was looking at. But he also knew that within 9 days, he had replicated the sole marking system in 14 additional boots, 9 belonging to prisoners who would carry them to different sectors of the camp, and 5 belonging to Confederate guards whose patrol routes provided new data he needed for the next escape window he was already calculating. The network was no longer a single tunnel team. It was moving. It was in the soles of boots, walking in every direction across 26 acres of Georgia clay, carrying information that looked exactly like where. 4 more men were planning to go through in 11 days. The sergeant came back on August 19th. This time he brought a lieutenant, and the lieutenant did not ask questions. He placed 31 boots on the ground in front of Elias's lean-to, all of them prisoner boots confiscated from men in the northern half of the camp the previous evening, and told Elias to repair them. Standard instruction. Nothing unusual. He then sat down on a fence post 12 feet away and watched. He watched for 4 hours without moving. Elias worked. He sorted the boots by condition, assessed each one in turn, pressed his thumb along the inner sole, noted the wear location, set it aside. He did this with the same unbroken rhythm he had maintained for 6 months. He did not look at the lieutenant. He did not alter his speed. He reached for the first boot requiring full sole replacement, positioned his awl above the cork, and paused. He had seen this boot before. 3 weeks earlier, it had come to him from a prisoner named Greer from Pennsylvania, who had needed the left heel rebuilt. Elias had rebuilt it. He had also, in the course of that rebuilding, set a 2mm crescent of recessed cork into the inner ball of the left sole, rearward of center. It meant the eastern fence line. Afternoon window, 3:10 p.m. He had done it the way he did everything, by hand, without external marking, with the confidence that only the right man pressing the right thumb into the right spot would understand it. The boot was now in the lieutenant's pile. Elias held it in both hands. He looked at the worn outer toe box. He looked at the heel he had rebuilt. He felt, under his left thumb, the faint crescent he had set into the cork 22 days ago. Still there, still legible to anyone who knew to press exactly there, with exactly that pressure. The lieutenant was still watching. Elias set the boot sole down on his knee. He reached for the awl. The lieutenant left at 4:17 p.m. He had sat on that fence post for 4 hours, watched Elias work through all 31 boots, and found nothing he could name. He picked up 2 of the repaired soles before leaving, turned them over, pressed them, set them down. He did not press the right places. He did not know the right places existed. He walked back through the north gate without speaking, and the gate closed behind him with the flat iron clank it always made. And Elias listened to that sound for 3 full seconds before he picked up his awl again. His hands were steady. They had been steady for 4 hours. That fact cost him more than anything else that day. He thought about what the lieutenant had seen. 31 boots in various states of repair, assessed and sorted by a prisoner who moved through his work with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing it since he was 14 years old. He thought about what the lieutenant had not seen. 9 of those 31 boots now carried new cork work in their inner soles. 9 sets of pressure markings indistinguishable from natural wear. Each one a directional coordinate and a time. Each one readable by a specific man in a specific part of the compound who knew exactly where to press his thumb. He thought about the lieutenant's eyes, pale, still, methodical, and he understood for the first time that the man who almost discovered him was not stupid. He was simply looking at the wrong surface. He was looking at the leather when he should have been looking at the cork. That was the gap the whole system lived in. 7 millimeters of compressed cork between the outer sole and the inner foot. The Confederacy never thought to look there, because the Confederacy did not think of cobblers as intelligence officers. It thought of them as cobblers. By September 1864, Elias Dodd had coordinated 6 successful escapes involving 14 men. By November, the number was 19 escapes and 31 men, of whom 26 had confirmed reached Union lines, a figure Elias would never know with certainty, because the confirmation method was a single sentence delivered through a prisoner in the next compound. Heard they got through. That sentence arrived in various forms, through various mouths, delayed by anywhere from 4 days to 3 weeks, and Elias treated it with the same statistical skepticism he applied to everything. He kept a count anyway. He kept it in the one place no one would search. The wear pattern of his own left boot's inner heel, which he remarked each time a confirmed escape came in, pressing a new, shallow groove into the cork with the tip of his awl until the crescent was deep enough to read with his thumb in the dark. By November, his left heel had 19 grooves in it. His boot looked like a man who walked with a pronounced outward lean. None of the Confederate guards who repaired through him noticed. The compound itself had changed by autumn. Camp Sumpter had reached its population peak of 33,000 in August and was declining catastrophically. Not because men were being released, but because men were dying at between 80 and 100 per day. By October, the rate dropped to 50. Not because conditions improved, but because there were fewer men left. The stockade that had held 33,000 in August held 12,000 by December. The same 26 acres emptier, the churned clay drying hard in the cooler air, the smell of the creek unchanged, the watchtowers fully staffed. Sherman's lines were 60 miles northeast. Every prisoner inside could hear, on the right kind of quiet morning, the distant percussion of artillery that had nothing to do with them yet. The guard rotations did not change. The deadline did not move. Elias adapted the system to the new population distribution. The exits still worked. The windows were still there. He had begun training others. Not for redundancy, he was not yet thinking about his own survival in those terms, but for capacity. One man examining boots in one 8x8 corner of a 26-acre compound could only gather so much patrol data in a given day. He needed eyes in the southern and western quadrants, where he rarely received Confederate boot work and where the guard patterns were, consequently, thinner in his knowledge. He trained 3 men over the course of 6 weeks. He trained them the way his father had trained him, not through explanation but through hands. He put a boot in front of each man, guided their thumb to the right position, pressed down until they felt what he felt, and released. You feel that? I feel something, a dip. That's 2 hours, Elias said. That's your number. Deep means short interval. Shallow means long. Don't guess. If you can't feel it, the boot is telling you to wait. Each of the 3 men required a different number of attempts before they could read reliably. The fastest, a former wagon wheel fitter from Pennsylvania named Corvin, needed 4 sessions over 11 days. The slowest needed 23 sessions over 6 weeks. None of them spoke about it outside of those sessions. They didn't need to be told why. By February 1865, Elias's network covered approximately 18 of the stockade's 26 acres with active data. He had mapped the patrol routes of 31 individual guards with enough accuracy to build 6 distinct escape windows across 4 sections of the fence line, each timed to a specific 18 to 30 second interval during the morning shift change. He had coordinated a total of 27 escapes. 7 of those men had been recaptured. 3 of those 7 died in the stocks within 10 days of recapture. But 37 men were free, confirmed through the compound messenger network, moving north through Georgia toward Sherman's supply lines. He kept grinding the grooves into his left heel. The boot was nearly through its cork by February. The problem began in January. Not with a Confederate guard, not with a search, but with a prisoner. His name was Ridley. He was from Maryland, captured at Spotsylvania in May 1864, and he had been at Andersonville for 8 months when the hunger finally collapsed whatever remained of his prior architecture. Elias had not selected him. Ridley had observed on his own, had watched the pattern of who brought what boot to whom, and had begun pressing his own thumb along his bunkmate's inner soles one night in December, and had felt something that meant nothing to him specifically, but which he understood was deliberate and systematic and therefore valuable. He traded it in January for 4 days of double rations. He didn't know what he was selling. He knew only the general shape of it. The cobbler in the northeastern corner marked the boots he repaired in a specific way, and men who received those boots escaped. He told this to a Confederate private named Stubbs, who had once slipped him an extra corn cake and who Ridley had mistaken over 8 months of proximity for something approaching human. The private told a sergeant. The sergeant told a lieutenant. Not the same lieutenant who had watched for 4 hours in August. A different one, a captain's adjutant named Greer, who was 24 years old and had been at Camp Sumpter since March 1864, and who had spent 10 months watching prisoners die of thirst without particular feeling. but who had, in that same 10 months, developed a competence for bureaucratic threat that his superiors had found useful. Greer did not immediately confront Elias. He spent 3 weeks watching the flow of boots through the northeastern corner. He identified 9 specific prisoners who had received repairs from Elias and subsequently attempted escape. 2 successful, 7 recaptured, and he built a pattern from the 9 cases that was directionally correct but mechanically incomplete. He knew that Elias's boots were connected to escape attempts. He didn't know how. He didn't know the cork. He thought initially that Elias was encoding information in the stitching, a logical assumption and a wrong one, and one that sent him staring at exterior thread patterns for 2 weeks before he abandoned it. He came to Elias on February 14th with 12 boots and a list of names. "These men," he said, setting the list on the ground between them. "You repaired boots for all 12 of them." Elias looked at the list without touching it. 8 of the names he recognized. 4 he didn't. "I repair what comes to me," he said. 6 of these men attempted to escape." "I wouldn't know about that." Greer crouched to his level. He was close enough that Elias could smell the tobacco on him. Cheap Virginia leaf. The kind the Confederate officers smoked when the better variety wasn't available, which had been consistently since October. "I'm going to tell you something," Greer said quietly. "I have authorization to move you to a closed facility. No tools, no materials, no work. I can do that today. Or you can tell me how the boots work." Elias set down his awl. He picked up the nearest of the 12 boots. He examined the sole. It was his own work. A heel he had rebuilt in November. New cork, flush set with no markings, because this one needed a new heel, he said. "This one needed a new heel," he said. The outer sole was separating along the welt. I reset it with 3 rows of stitching. "That's what you're looking at." Greer took the boot. He looked at it for a long time. He set it down. He picked up 2 more and studied them with the detailed attention of a man who had taught himself to read in a language he did not speak. He found nothing. He left the 12 boots. He did not move Elias to a closed facility, but he posted a second guard at the northeastern corner of the compound. A man who sat 30 feet from Elias's lean-to from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day beginning February 15th, watching. Elias kept working. He modified the marking system that same evening, shifting the crescent position 4 millimeters forward on all future marks, so that any boot Greer had examined before February 15th would read differently from any boot examined after. He was, in effect, rekeying the entire cipher with a 4 millimeter adjustment in one night by memory without notes, without any material record. He was also starting to build one. The leather strip was 9 inches long, 1.5 inches wide, and cut from the tongue of a Confederate boot whose owner had died of fever in the camp hospital in January, and whose effects had come to Elias as scrap. He had been thinking about making it for weeks, resisting the idea because a physical record was a physical vulnerability, finally accepting in February that a network operating across 18 acres with 4 active practitioners reading marks in the dark needed a reference that didn't depend on any single man's memory. He worked on it for 19 days, evenings only, using the awl to press a series of shallow position marks into the leather in a system that looked, to anyone who didn't already know it, like tool scuffs from a repairman's bench. It wasn't text, it wasn't diagrams. It was pressure point coordinates. The same logic as the boot marks themselves turned into a reference strip. 8 positions across the width of the leather. 3 depth levels per position. A full read of the strip, run thumb left to right in 4 seconds, gave you the complete current marking key. Direction, timing, fence sector. He tested it on Corvin, the former wagon wheel fitter, on the 14th day of its construction. Corvin ran his thumb along it once, top to bottom. Northeast, 547. South gate, 310. West corner. He stopped. West corner changed. February 15th, Elias said, 4 millimeters forward. I have that right. Then keep it. He hid the strip in the lining of his own left boot, behind the heel cup, against the ankle. It was 9 inches by 1.5 inches. It added no visible bulk. The boot looked exactly as it had before. The network's largest operation, its last, came on the night of March 12, 1865. 9 men, 3 different fence sectors, 3 different windows, timed 8 minutes apart to prevent the exits from overlapping into each other's detection risk. The operation required 3 separate sole-marked boots to carry coordinates to 3 separate tunnel team leaders, each of whom received only their own window and nothing about the others. It required all 4 members of Elias's reading network to be active simultaneously, verifying patrol data in their respective compound sectors over a 48-hour observation period before the marks were cut. 7 of the 9 men made it through. 1 was recaptured 600 yards outside the wire. 1 broke an ankle in the abatis and could not move fast enough. The 7 who cleared the perimeter were through the forest cover within 11 minutes and in contact with a Union cavalry patrol 3 days later, 34 miles north of Andersonville. Elias cut the last grooves into his left heel cork that morning. 31 confirmed through. 14 failed or recaptured. 4 dead in the stocks. The math was still the math. He was not going to make it out himself. He had understood this since November, when the calculation had become unavoidable. The man operating the system could not use the system, because the system required him to be present and working with every boot that entered the network. The moment he disappeared, the information flow stopped. Every escape after August 4th had been a choice. His choice, unmade each morning for 7 months, to stay at the 8x8 patch of ground and keep pressing his thumb into leather. He had no word for this. He simply kept working. April 5th, 1865. The war was 4 days from ending, though no one inside Camp Sumpter's fence knew that. Lee's army was retreating through Virginia ahead of Grant's lines, compressed into a shrinking corridor between Petersburg and Appomattox, and the Confederate command structure that managed Camp Sumpter was operating with the specific institutional confidence of men who do not yet know they have lost. Captain Renfield Cade of the 55th Georgia, the officer commanding the day watch at Camp Sumpter since January, a 38-year-old former cotton factor from Milledgeville who had managed prisoner logistics for 4 years with meticulous administrative competence. Summon Elias to the guard station at the North Gate at 7 a.m. to repair a pair of officers' riding boots. This was not unusual. Elias had received work from the guard station before. He carried his tools, the awl, the wire, the remaining leather scraps, in a single canvas roll that the gate guards searched each time he passed through. They searched it that morning. They found nothing. They passed him through. He was in the guard station for 2 hours and 11 minutes. He repaired the boots. He was rolling up his tool canvas, his fingers pressing the familiar weight of the awl through the fabric, the wire coil, the last 3 inches of spare leather, when the strip slipped from behind his heel cup. It was the boot itself that betrayed him, specifically the left boot's heel cup, which had been slowly separating from the ankle lining for 3 weeks under the stress of daily movement, pulling the stitching at the rear seam, widening the hidden pocket until it was no longer a pocket but an open gap. The strip fell heel first onto the guard station floor. It made almost no sound. 9 inches of dried leather on packed clay, the same soft flat click as a single stitch pulling loose. But the Confederate private cleaning the station's bench tool rack heard it, turned, and picked it up before Elias's hand had finished closing around air. The private looked at it. He could see there were markings on it. He handed it to the sergeant without a word. The sergeant handed it to Captain Cade. Cade examined the strip for approximately 6 minutes. He ran his thumbnail along the marks, not his thumb pad, his nail, which could not read the depth differentials and told him nothing about the system's logic. But it told him this: the marks were deliberate, regular, and made by the same hand that had just repaired his officer's boots. He set the strip on the table between himself and Elias. He looked at Elias for a long time. "What is this?" he said. Elias looked at the strip. "Leather scrap, tool gauge, for checking all depth, marking the calibrations." Cade picked the strip up again. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had spent 4 years managing the logistics of 33,000 prisoners with a combination of administrative precision and the complete incuriosity of someone who had never needed to imagine the inner life of the people he was managing. He looked at the strip for another 90 seconds without speaking. Then he set it in the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and buttoned the pocket closed. "Take him to the Eastern holding pen," he said to the sergeant. "April 6th, 1865, 8:17 a.m., 3 days before Lee signed at Appomattox, 68 days before Elias Dodd would have walked out of the North Gate in the general prisoner exchange, and the last morning of his life. The Eastern holding pen was a 12-by-8 enclosure of vertical pine stakes set inside the main stockade wall, used for prisoners under disciplinary confinement. Elias had been in it since 8 p.m. the previous evening, without his tools, without his leather, in 42-degree Georgia April darkness that pressed through the gaps in the pine stakes with the specific cold of dawn not yet arrived. The sergeant came for him at 8:10 a.m. They walked him to the eastern fence line, not toward the gate, toward the fence itself, toward the section of stockade wall between Watchtower 11 and Deadline Post 19, which Elias had never mapped because the patrol patterns in the eastern sector were too irregular for reliable corridor windows, and he had deprioritized it in October. He had a clear view of the watchtower from where they stopped him. He could see, even in those last 7 minutes, that the tower's morning sweep ran east to west, which told him the sun angle was wrong for a reliable gap in this sector at this hour. The data was still coming in. His hands, empty, were still reading. Captain Cade was not present. He had filed no order in writing. He would file no report afterward. The sergeant who carried out the instruction was never asked about it in any formal inquiry, because no formal inquiry into Elias Dodd was ever initiated, because Elias Dodd appeared in no formal record as a person requiring inquiry. He appeared in the shoemaker's material requisition list, paid in full someone else's pen, and in the testimony of 23 men who walked out of Andersonville alive and were never asked in the 1865 congressional hearing that sent Henry Wirtz to the gallows about the cobbler in the northeastern corner. They were never asked because no one knew to ask. Captain Renfield Cade returned to Milledgeville after the war. He operated a cotton brokerage for 22 years and died in 1889. His personal papers, donated to the Georgia State Archives by his family in 1931, contain no reference to Camp Sumpter, to any prisoner cobbler, or to a leather strip 9 inches long. The strip itself was never recovered from his effects. It had been in his breast pocket on April 6, 1865. After that, it was gone. In 2003, a graduate researcher at the University of Georgia named Patricia Lawson was cross-referencing survivor testimony from the 1865 Andersonville Commission hearings for a study on prisoner communication networks. She had been working the archive for 14 months when she found the first anomaly. 4 separate survivor accounts, given by men who had never met in the post-war period and who lived in Ohio, Indiana, New York, and Vermont, all contained the same phrase when asked how they had known when to attempt escape. Not paraphrased, not similar. The same 4 words: the boots told us. She found 19 more accounts over the next 8 months, from men scattered across 11 states, interviewed at different times between 1865 and 1908. All 23 accounts contained the phrase. Some elaborated, most did not. One account, from a former furniture maker in Indiana named Corvin, contained a single additional sentence. There was a man from Ohio who understood shoes the way some men understand people. I never knew his last name. I heard he was from Galion. Lawson spent 3 years searching Crawford County birth and enlistment records before she found the entry. Elias Dodd, born Galion, Ohio, 1833, enlisted 52nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, May 1862. Captured Chickamauga, September 1863. Entered Andersonville, February 27th, 1864. The record ends there. Cause of death, unrecorded. Date of death, unrecorded. Location of remains, unknown. The shoemaker's material requisition list, the one with the pencil notation in the right margin, paid in full in someone else's handwriting, was found in a miscellaneous Confederate logistics file at the National Archives in 2006. It is the only document in the Federal Archive system that places Elias Dodd's name inside the stockade at Andersonville. The handwriting beside his name has never been matched to any identified person. He was shot 3 days before the war ended, in the 8th year of his life spent understanding that a man's soul tells you everything about the path he walked, and nothing at all about what it cost him. The boots knew. Nobody wrote it down. The folder was labeled Andersonville Commission Testimonies, Supplemental 1865 to 1908, and it was stored in Box 114 of Record Group 153 at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., on the 4th shelf from the floor in a climate-controlled room that smelled of document preservation wax and old cotton fiber paper. A smell Patricia Lawson had stopped noticing after the first month, but which she would, years later, identify as the specific smell of information that had been waiting longer than any living person had been looking for it. She had been entering that room every morning at 8:30 a.m. for the past 14 months. The folder contained 61 individual witness statements, collected across 4 decades by 3 different congressional offices, none of which had ever cross-referenced them with each other. Lawson had been working through them sequentially, the paper cool and slightly resistant under her fingers, the way old ledger stock always was, slightly thicker than modern paper, slightly less willing to lie flat. She was on statement 38 when she stopped. The statement was from a man named Horace Birch of Montpelier, Vermont, interviewed in 1903, age 66, a former Union private who had spent 7 months at Camp Sumpter before the prisoner exchange of November 1864. The interviewer had asked him a standard question from the Commission's supplemental questionnaire. By what means, if any, did you receive information relevant to escape attempts? Birch's answer was 2 sentences. The second sentence was, "The boots told us." Lawson set down her pencil. She had read 37 prior statements that morning, across a combined span of 4 hours and 22 minutes, and her pencil had moved through most of them with the even rhythm of someone transcribing rather than discovering. It stopped now. She had seen that phrase before. Not in this box, not in this record group. Somewhere in the 14 months of archive she had opened behind her like a corridor, that phrase had appeared, in a different hand, in different ink, on a different page. She spent the next 3 hours finding it. It was in Statement 11, filed in Box 112, from a man in Columbus, Ohio, interviewed in 1887. "We were told by the boots," is the only way I can put it. Not the exact phrase, close enough to stop her breathing for a moment. She flagged it. She went back to the folder. By the end of that day, she had found 4 accounts containing the phrase, or a version of it, spread across 3 different boxes, filed by 3 different congressional offices, in testimonies collected between 1865 and 1903. None of the 4 men had met each other in the post-war years. She confirmed this through the pension records. They lived in Vermont, Ohio, New York, and Maryland. They had been interviewed years apart by interviewers who had no knowledge of each other's files. They all said the same 4 words. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table in Athens, Georgia, for a long time without eating. She was 29 years old and in the 3rd year of her graduate research on prisoner communication networks in the Civil War. She had expected to find signals, codes, ciphers. The standard literature on wartime prisoner communication ran heavily toward language, toward message systems, toward the kind of intellectual architecture that left a legible record. She had not expected 4 men in 4 states across 4 decades to independently produce the same 4-word answer to the same question, and she had no framework yet for what it meant. She went back the next morning at 8 a.m. and started from Statement 1. Patricia Lawson had grown up in Macon, Georgia, 85 miles from the Andersonville National Historic Site, and had visited it once as a child, age 9, with her mother and grandmother on a Saturday in October 1983. She remembered the Providence Spring Monument and the rows of white grave markers, and the way the reconstructed stockade wall cast a shadow across the cemetery in the afternoon light that made it look like the wall was still performing its original function. She had not returned. She was not sentimental about the visit. What she remembered most specifically was that her grandmother, who had grown up in a small town 40 miles east and who had no documented ancestry connected to the camp in any direction, had stood at the north gate entrance for approximately 4 minutes without speaking and then walked back to the car and waited. She had begun her doctoral research in 2001 at the University of Georgia under an advisor who specialized in prisoner of war logistics. Her research question was narrow and archival. How did prisoners in major Civil War camps transmit tactical information internally, given the systematic suppression of written materials by camp authorities? The standard answers existed: hidden notes, verbal chains, tapping codes on barracks walls, the position of clothing hung on fence lines, and Lawson had documented all of them across 2 years of prior archive work, and none of them led anywhere new. Every known prisoner communication method left a residue she could trace: confiscated notes in Confederate after-action reports, tapping codes referenced in survivor memoirs, verbal chain betrayals logged in disciplinary records. The methods left evidence because the Confederates had found and suppressed them. The thing at Camp Sumpter left almost no evidence, which meant either it had not existed or it had worked. Nobody had asked the right question yet. The right question, as Lawson understood it only gradually over 14 months in the archive, was not what the prisoners communicated, but in what medium. The medium was the answer. And the medium, in at least one documented case at Camp Sumpter, had been so ordinary that it had survived 140 years inside a federal archive without anyone identifying it as a communication system, because nobody had thought to look at it as one. She spent 8 months after that first day finding the remaining 19 accounts. They came from men in 11 states, interviewed between 1865 and 1908 by 6 different congressional and administrative bodies. She found them by reading every word of every supplemental testimony in record groups, 94, 109, and 153 at the National Archives. Approximately 4,200 pages of handwritten and typewritten text, plus 800 pages of pension amendment filings she cross-referenced against the testimony roster for name matches. She worked 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 8 months. She found 23 accounts total. All 23 contained the phrase. None of the 23 men had been asked a follow-up question about what it meant. The 23rd account was the one that gave her a name. It was filed in the pension amendment records, not the testimony records, which was why it had taken 8 months to reach it. Corvin, M.A., former corporal, 14th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, pension amendment filed 1901, Terre Haute, Indiana. The amendment itself was a routine disability claim for a knee injury sustained at Spotsylvania. Attached to the amendment, in the loose leaf addendum where claimants could include supplementary information, was a handwritten note that Corvin had apparently added without being asked, on a single sheet of ruled paper in pencil, beginning, "I have thought often about Andersonville and what happened there, and what I know that I have not told anyone outside of my family, because I did not know who to tell and because nobody asked. There was a man from Ohio there who understood shoes the way some men understand people. I never knew his last name. He showed me how to read what he put in the soles. I heard he was from Galion. I heard he did not get out." Lawson read this note 4 times in the archive room before she wrote anything down. Then she wrote, Crawford County, birth records, Galion. She drove to the Ohio History Center in Columbus 3 weeks later, in February 2004, in a rental car, 8 hours each way, and spent 4 days in their manuscript room, working through Crawford County vital records for the decade 1830 to 1840, and enlistment records for the 52nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. She found 3 men named Dodd from Galion in the enlistment records. 2 had been killed in action, both documented. The third was listed as captured date September 19, 1863, location Chickamauga, Georgia. His first name was Elias. His age at enlistment was 29. His occupation was listed as cordwainer, the formal term for a shoemaker who works exclusively in new leather, as distinct from a cobbler who repairs existing goods. Elias Dodd, Galion, Ohio, cordwainer, captured Chickamauga. Last known status, prisoner. She checked the prisoner exchange records for November 1864, the exchange that had freed Corvin and several hundred other prisoners from Andersonville. Elias Dodd was not on the exchange list. She checked the February 1865 transfer records. He was not there. She checked the Andersonville death register. 12,912 names. The most complete Confederate prison mortality record in existence, compiled by Union forces after the camp's liberation in May 1865. His name was not there either. He was not in the exchange, he was not in the transfer, he was not in the death register, he was not in the discharge records, he was not in any Union Army prisoner of war database she could access across 6 separate federal archives over the following 11 months. He had simply ceased to exist at some point between February 27, 1864, the day he entered the North Gate, and May 2, 1865, when the camp was liberated. She found 2 other men during that period who showed the same pattern, present in Confederate records on arrival, absent from all post-war accounting, and she tried both of them first, spending 4 months on each, because she was being methodical, and because methodical was the only approach that worked in an archive, where the gaps were often more informative than the contents. Neither of the 2 men led anywhere. She returned to Elias Dodd in January 2005. The shoemaker's material requisition list was in Box 7 of Record Group 109 at the National Archives. Confederate records, captured administrative files, Andersonville subgroup. The list was 4 pages long, handwritten in brownish ink on ledger paper, covering the period March through December 1864. It documented requests for leather, cork, hooping wire, all stock, and heel blanks made by a prisoner craftsman operating in the northeastern quadrant of the stockade compound, authorized by the camp quartermaster under a standing work release arrangement. The craftsman's name appeared at the top of the first page. E. Dodd, N.E. Sector. Authorized material draw. It was the only document in the Federal Archive system containing that name and that location simultaneously. Lawson's hands were not shaking when she found it. She had been doing this for 2 years and 3 months by then, and the physical experience of discovery in an archive is rarely cinematic. It is usually the quiet replacement of a cold space in your understanding with something warmer, the confirmation of a shape you had already half built in the dark. She felt that. She also felt the paper itself, requisition ledger stock, slightly damp at the lower right corner, from a water exposure that had occurred at some point in the 140 years since it was written. The ink faded to brown but entirely legible. The handwriting even and unhurried and trained. Then she turned to page 3, bottom margin, right side. Someone had written in pencil, in handwriting different from the ledger's primary ink. A lighter, faster, more compressed hand. The kind that suggests a note added quickly and perhaps without full consideration of permanence. E. Dodd, paid in full. The initials. The ledger line terminated. No date, no signature. She sat with it for 11 minutes. Then she photographed it with her archive camera, a practiced flat-angle shot with no shadow on the margin, and requested a provenance trace on the pencil notation from the archive's document conservation office. The trace came back 6 weeks later. Graphite pencil, mid to late 19th century composition, consistent with post-war addition to a wartime document. The handwriting had not been matched to any identified individual in the federal comparison database. It had not been matched to the Confederate quartermaster who maintained the ledger. It had not been matched to Elias Dodd himself, whose handwriting sample, taken from his enlistment form in Columbus, bore no resemblance. Someone had added that note after the war. Someone who knew the ledger existed, could access it, and chose to write those 3 words in pencil rather than ink. Someone who wanted the notation legible but not permanent. Paid in full. A ledger line closed. An account settled. The records of Captain Renfield Cade, 55th Georgia Infantry, were donated to the Georgia State Archives in Macon in 1931 by his grandson Robert H. Cade, a cotton merchant from Macon who characterized the papers in his donation letter as documents of military and administrative service, Camp Sumpter period. The collection comprised 4 boxes of correspondence, order copies, supply manifests, and personal letters spanning 1862 to 1865. Lawson drove to Macon in March 2006 and spent 3 days in the archive. The Cade papers contain 847 individual documents. Lawson read every one of them. She was looking for 3 things: a reference to a prisoner cobbler, a reference to a leather strip or marking system, and a reference to an execution order for April 6, 1865. She found none of them. What she found instead was a gap, a specific structural absence that was itself a form of information. The Camp Sumpter administrative correspondence in the Cade papers runs continuously from January 1865 through April 4th, 1865. There is then no document dated April 5th. There is no document dated April 6th. The next document is dated April 7th, a supply requisition for corn, signed by Cade, written in his standard administrative hand, with no indication of anything preceding it that might require explanation. 3 days of his service at Camp Sumpter produced no paperwork. In a man whose papers contain an average of 3.7 documents per operational day for the preceding 4 months, a 3-day gap is not absence of record. It is a record of absence. She photographed every page of the Cade collection. She requested permission to have the April 7th document analyzed for stress markers in the handwriting, a technique used occasionally in question document examination to detect writing produced under unusual psychological conditions. And the Georgia State Archives declined the request on preservation grounds. She did not press. She had what she needed. She drove back to Athens that evening, 85 miles, the same highway that runs roughly parallel to the route Sherman's men had used 140 years earlier, moving north through Georgia. And she thought about that's the 9-inch leather strip that Cade had placed in the breast pocket of his uniform jacket on April 5th, 1865, buttoned the pocket closed, and carried out of Camp Sumpter when the war ended. She thought about 140 years of cotton brokerage and donated papers and a grandson who characterized his grandfather's service as administrative. She thought about the weight of cork in a boot sole, 14 grams approximately, thin carved, almost nothing against the foot, and how it had been enough. She published her findings in the Journal of Military History in the spring of 2007. The article was 41 pages long and included 23 appendices. It was titled Sole Evidence, Material Communication Systems in the Camp Sumpter Prisoner Compound, 1864 to 1865. It received 14 citations in the first 2 years after publication, which for a specialized military history journal is a significant number. A short version appeared in Civil War Times in 2008. A film producer optioned the story in 2009 and let the option lapse in 2011 without producing anything. The story of a man who left no image, no voice recording, no confirmed grave, and whose only instrument was a piece of cork in someone else's shoe. It turns out this is a difficult thing to sell. The article contains no photograph of Elias Dodd. No such photograph is known to exist. It contains no sample of his handwriting beyond the enlistment form in Columbus, in which he described himself as 5 feet, 10 inches tall, brown hair, gray eyes, occupation, cordwainer. The enlistment officer recorded his distinguishing marks as burn scars, both forearms, extensive. The kind a man accumulates over years of working iron close, leather close, fire close, doing the specific physical work of understanding materials from the inside, from where the heat is, from where things fail or hold. The article ends with Corvin's testimony from 1901. The last line of that testimony, deadliest, the line Lawson chose to close 41 pages of documented evidence, is the same line she had found first in a pension amendment addendum on ruled paper in pencil, written by a man in Terre Haute, Indiana, who had pressed his thumb into a boot sole in a Georgia prison compound in 1864 and understood without words that someone had placed something there deliberately. I heard he didn't get out. Elias Dodd's name was added to the Andersonville National Historic Sites Supplemental Memorial List in April 2009, 144 years after his death, 144 years after the date was entered nowhere, and the cause was filed under nothing, and the man who ordered it drove home to Milledgeville and opened a cotton brokerage, and never once in 24 years of subsequent life mentioned the cobbler who had read his guards by their boots, the leather strip, 9 inches, 1.5 inches wide, 8 position marks, 3 depth levels, a complete cipher held in a surface no one thought to read, has never been found. Somewhere in the 4-box Cade collection, or in a house that no longer stands in Milledgeville, or in 140 years of Georgia soil, there exists a piece of dried leather that remembers every escape window Elias Dodd ever calculated, every fence sector, every 22-second gap in a Confederate rotation that a man in an 8x8 patch of ground found with his thumb and pressed into cork without a word. The boots carried it. The boots wore through. The cork compressed past reading. The leather returned to ground. He was shot at 8:17 a.m. on April 6, 1865. He was 31 years old. He had buried 11 men he knew by name and helped 31. He mostly didn't escape the ground he would not leave himself. He was listed in the shoemaker's ledger as a material credit, closed out in pencil by someone who knew what he had done and chose 3 words: an ink that fades and a margin where no one looks.